Thanks very much, Nikki. That's great. It's really good to see so many people joining us live tonight, and we believe that we'll be able to also increase our the people that get to see this by the recordings that we're doing. Once again, thanks to the Gary White Foundation. They've obviously considered that topic of drought resilience is really important in horse pastures and on horse properties. And so we're looking forward to hearing the effect that soil health can have on drought resilience. So I'd like to hand over to our speaker today. And if you could introduce yourself, Chris, and tell us a little bit about soils.
Certainly. Thanks very much, Kathy, and thank you all for getting this act together. It's taken a bit of time and a bit of practice for us to understand the whole system. But look, I think we're dealing with pretty important topics here. So I hope that all those that are participating in this will get some information out of this. There'll be a lot of information, so it's a little bit like perhaps throwing a bit of horse manure against a wall and some of it will stick. But the point is you'll have the opportunity for questions. And even if if people wanted to get in touch with me for more technical and more advanced knowledge, if you like, my emails are available, so we can contact me at a later date. I guess just to start, it's reasonably ironic when we're dealing with how to manage our properties and pastures in dry weather, when we've just had an enormous downpour. We just had 20 minutes of torrential rain, which is well and truly needed. On my property at Macclesfield, I've still got cracks in the soil that are around about 2 to 3 centimetres in some places wide. So it's going to take a while for the moisture to soak into the soil and for it to get back to its normal situation. But I'd like to just start with our first slide explaining a little bit about soil and its functions and what's involved in its understanding. You'll notice on that slide there's a pie chart there which represents a volume percent of what's in the soil. So if it happens to be my soil or your soil on your properties and you feel it between your fingers, what you're feeling, it might be greasy, indicating it's a clay soil, or it might be sandy. That's the mineral component, and pretty much there's a fair bit of the chemistry tied up in those minerals. So on that pie chart, that's consisting of around about 46% of the volume. The air and water makes up the balance of that, along with organic matter of spaces in the soil. Of course, soil pores, 25% air and water. Now, in theory, that sounds fantastic, but that's out of a textbook. It's a conventional silty loam soil. That may not be the soil that you're dealing with. I had the opportunity this morning to have an interview with a Deakin student doing her agriculture. We have a little bit of fertilisation at the moment.
If we could just stop there, Chris. It looks like Alison hasn't got their microphone muted. Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
Yes, not that it's any different. Sometimes it's nice. There might be a good recipe that I can sort of hook into and some advice, but perhaps we better stick to soils. Yes. I just mentioned I had an interview with a PhD student from Deakin that was doing things on regenerative agriculture. And I just said to her, look, this is the pie chart we show, but people on their own properties have got to adopt that. In other words, almost take an empty circle to their property and figure out what's going on with the soil. The clod of soil underneath that chart, and I know we might have some Macclesfield residents on this particular session tonight, and they will understand that our soils at Macclesfield, for instance, are silty soils, incredibly compact. So if they're as compact as that, I suppose the question to all of you would be, is that likely to squeeze out the air and water spaces in the soil? And the obvious answer to that is yes. So that pie chart really might consist of 70% minerals and only 10% air and water and whatever organic matter makes that up. So that means that's not the most ideal soil for getting photosynthesis to operate and to grow whatever we're growing, whether it's pastures or whether it's in a horticultural situation. So when I was teaching sustainability at Swinburne Uni, we did a pot experiment with our Macclesfield soils, and you'll see that the 2 pots there of silver beet, and basically we did replicated trials there. And the way we managed this was to work around that pie chart and assess each part of it. So in terms of understanding the minerals in that soil, we got a full soil analysis. So we understood it was pretty low in a lot of the major nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, trace elements. So the way we amended that, because it was a pot trial, we just used some dynamic lifters, an all-purpose mineral, sort of a fertiliser in an organic form, if you like. Then we had to address the problem with air and water, a very compact soil. With our soil, when you feel it, I always get people to close their eyes and to feel our soil between their fingers and say, what does that feel like? Does that feel like wholemeal flour? And people say, yes, yes. I said, well, that's indicative of basically the texture of the soil and how fine-grained it is. And what that means is, if I use the analogy of a nut and a bolt, it hasn't got the washer separating the nut and the bolt. So if you think of those little soil particles, the grains of silt in that soil, they're not being separated by organic matter, so it becomes incredibly compact. So to address that, we added some good compost, which obviously also inoculated the soil with microorganisms. So in that sense, we've managed the pore space, we've opened it up and plant roots can get down there. And you can see from the diagram there that the soil that was not amended at all, the silver beet seedlings basically just stood still. They didn't grow at all. But once we'd addressed all the various components at that soil, basically we had fantastic silver beet seedlings. So what that really does indicate is that if we, for instance, look at that pie chart and we had a soil analysis on our property and we only addressed the mineral component in terms of a fertiliser, and we didn't address the physical parameters of the soil, which are responsible for air and water and the biological, then we could be wasting our money. So it's very much a holistic approach to managing our soils.
And Chris, excuse me, there's no doubt that the soil composition in terms of that air and water has a big impact during drought.
Oh, absolutely. It doesn't take much imagination to think that compacted soil you're looking at there, that's the surface of, let's say, your pastures, and I've got Suffolk sheep on my pastures, and you get any sort of rainfall, and basically that's going to run off because it's so compact, that soil's not going to soak in, and that's very typical of Macclesfield soils. And as I say to people, you know, one of the problems is that with our very variable climate, you're looking forward to a front coming across and getting some rain, and it may only be a centimetre, you know, 10 mils, maybe a little bit more. But if it's a compacted soil like that, it's either going to evaporate very quickly or run off. So in other words, the plant roots aren't benefiting at all. But if we have a soil that's a little bit more open, and we'll discuss that in a moment, and there's a bit of grass cover, there's a bit of a combination that goes on here because we've got a little bit more grass cover, then that's going to hold the water as well. So we might move on to the second slide. Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, thanks for that.
This is just an illustration of what healthy soils and what soils look like. And it's a pretty old slide, actually, from a United States Ag Department book of looking at various rotations. And if we look at just that first one, that's what virgin sod from the prairies. In other words, the areas, if we go back to the 1940s, it was affected by the Dust Bowl, incredibly rich black soils full of organic matter. That was the sort of soil structure that you had. And you can see all those particles there. And it doesn't take much stretch of the imagination to think, well, if I drop that onto a concrete path, it's going to shatter and go everywhere. That is absolutely perfect habitat for microorganisms, for earthworms, and quite obviously for moisture absorption. You don't have to think very deeply to think, gee, if I pour water on that, that's going to soak in really quickly. The next one, where those soil particles, what we call aggregates, are still present, but it's changed a little bit. There's a little bit more hardness coming into it. And that's a rotation of corn, oats, clover, and wheat. Now, clover is a soil building because it's a legume, but corn and oats and those crops are quite hungry. They take nutrients out of the soil. So being so hungry, you can see that they're starting to affect the physical parameters of the soil. And the last one, which is not far off what rotation in the States is at the moment, is basically corn, soybeans. Corn is an incredibly hungry crop if ever you've grown it in your own gardens. It takes a lot of manures and nitrogen fertilizers to get it to grow. But what's happened with that rotation, there's no resting period, there's no great lot of plant roots that are getting into the soil, and it's toughened and hardened up. So you end up being quite a compacted soil, and it ends up, in terms of a production enterprise, quite deficient in nutrients with all sorts of trace element deficiencies, let alone if you happen to be in the United States and those nitrogen fertilizers then wash down the Mississippi into the very toxic Gulf of Mexico. So in a sense, I use this at field days to that picture of those slides and say, okay, let's dig a hole in our paddock. Let's have a look at our soil and see which one your soil is close to that. So this is a little bit of homework for you all, to when you've got the opportunity to just take a little bit of a soil spit out of your paddock and having a memory of what these slides looked at, see if you can break it open, see if those soil particles are there, because that's just so important. If we go to slide 3, thanks, Kathy. This is more recently on a field day I had down at Gippsland, and it was on a property with one of the growers there. Was actually renting one of his fields to a chap that was producing peas. It was a continuous rotation of peas. And what we're looking at there in the soil, and this was during prolonged dry period, my colleague and I, we tried to dig with a shovel into that picture on the left-hand side there, and we couldn't, rather than we were chipping away at the surface, but the spade wouldn't penetrate more than about 5 or 6 millimeters. It's just so tough. It was a little bit strange because your peas you think are a soil building crop, but because it was continuous cultivation with a rotary hoe, as soon as you open up a soil, rotary hose and exposure to oxygen burns up, oxidizes organic matter, and it starts to collapse. Interestingly enough, I asked my colleague to just go a little bit closer to the fence where the ploughs and crop hadn't been put in, and his soil went down to spade depth really easily. And although that soil clod you're looking at is a little bit further away in terms of our vision, you can still see the crumbly nature of it. And the landowner there was actually quite shattered. He said, look, I'm renting this paddock to this bloke, and he's actually destroying my soil. So it's a bit of a wake-up call that various methods of management can do that. If we bring it back to a horse situation, or even a grazing property, and it could be cattle, livestock, let alone horses. I've got sheep, and we graze the grasses down pretty close to the soil level. Similar things can happen to the organic matter in that soil. It can lead to a decline, and the soil might start to get a little bit more compact as well. So understanding how we get that soil is really, really important. That soil clod dug out by the spade had both clovers, ubiquitous white clover, but also cocksfoot, which is a very deep-rooted perennial grass, because it's the plant roots in a lot of those grasses, particularly perennial grasses, which basically, well, around about 50% of them decompose during the growing season when you've got moisture and temperature, and they form those soil particles. And it's a combination of microbial action and fungi and little glues like polysaccharides, which glue those particles together. So, I mean, to me, it's such a fascinating thing to think that's a mixture of the chemistry, the clay particles, the biology, and obviously the physical structure of the soil getting air and water into it.
Chris, it sounds like we're actually growing our own organic matter when we've got a pasture.
That's exactly right, Kathy, and that's a great comment, because that's the question quite often I get at field days. Not everybody has the benefit of being able to bring in a truckload of compost and adding organic matter. It's not a horticultural situation where you might put in a green manure or a cover crop in your home garden, you add lots of mulch. You're out on a paddock and a pasture. So the only way to do that is by growing, if we can, a mixture of species with deep-rooting plants. Now, I often reflect, I tell people, and some of you may have heard my anecdotes like that, but my background in earth sciences as well as my qualifications in soils. I love looking at cuttings when I'm driving along. I do, thank you, I do keep an eye on the road.
That's road cuttings.
But the cuttings itself, looking at the depth of the topsoil, I can think of our road in Macclesfield, Swales Road, and either Ron and Marianne would recognise this. And you look at that topsoil, and then, oh, gee, we'd be lucky if we got 8 to 9 millimetres of topsoil when you look at that cutting. And you've got to think, well, where did that come from? Because it's all bush. And you think, oh, well, it's over time, hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. That vegetation, whether it's herbaceous plants, grasses and tree roots, have formed that top soil, which we're calling the topsoil, the fertility of the soil. And then we go and remove all the trees and we put in pastures. And that's our fertility that we're basically starting our production enterprise on. And it doesn't matter whether we're grazing horses or cattle or a horticultural enterprise. What we're trying to do is say, okay, that's the depth of my topsoil. How can I improve that? Nature's done it in the past, and that's a lesson there. Nature's done it in the past by a whole range of different species with different rooting capacities to form that soil. And in our case, because of the environment we live in, it's a very shallow topsoil, which puts even more emphasis on how we should manage it.
Yeah,
So
great. Thank you.
Might go to the next slide. Thank you, Kathy. There we have my wonderful left arm there, holding a lovely sod from a pasture. It's probably up near Neerim Junction. We did a number of field trials up there in perennial pasture. And that's what we'd love to see in root systems of the plants that are growing on our pasture, that they actually trail down. And you can see all the particles that are actually sticking to roots. And that, again, is a biological phenomenon. When you've got the particles sticking to plant roots, it's usually carbon extracts, what we call plant root exudates, that are given off from the plant roots that actually help and hold those particles together. So, we're pretty thrilled to be able to dig into the pasture and see that. But again, that's very much a nature of rotational grazing on this particular paddock. So to get the roots down to that level, it's a bit like the iceberg effect, isn't it? You've got the top part of the iceberg and you've got so much underwater. Well, pasture's similar like that. So if we've got the opportunity to rotate our animals and let that grass grow to a little bit of length, when we've got more opportunity for those roots to push down. And I can hear a number of you saying, well, that's great in theory. We've just been through a massive dry period, and where our animals are forced basically to eat what we've got. And I was no different on my property with my sheep. They ate it down to a much lower level than I would have liked. And I indicated that to my student who was here this morning. I said, quite often in grazing management, and some of you would have heard that story, or the idea when you're grazing animals is that you use the so-called stubby principle, that you grow your pasture and grass up to the height of a stubby, and then you get them to eat it down to the level when the stubby is horizontally on the ground, which, what does that mean? It's probably about 6 to 8 centimetres from the soil surface. And that is, there's two aspects to that. One is obviously covering the soil and protecting it, but it's also, and trapping moisture when we do get the rain, but it's also allowing all those little solar collectors in the grass to basically take the sun's energy, photosynthesize and grow more grass. So if we're rotating animals around from paddock to paddock, or our horses, it's really important if we can manage to do that by leaving enough grass for those little solar collectors, if you like, in the grass leaves, to maximize the sun's energy and to grow. And the difference would be, if we grow it close to the ground, that may take 2 months, 3 months for the grass to grow back to a reasonable level. Yet if we'd left it at 5 to 8 centimetres, if you like, it could bounce back in maybe 2 to 3 weeks, given the right growing conditions. So in a sense, that boils down to our management, and that's that can be very difficult in doing that particular one. We might go to the next slide. Thanks, Kathy, because I think that's so. When I had a field day at my place a number of weeks ago before Christmas, and I was illustrating. Just thinking what my next slide shows as well, but this is obviously overgrazed pastures that my sheep had taken. And we've got to think of how we can get around that compared to one where the grass was allowed to grow and bounce back. So we might just move to the next slide. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah. So what I was illustrating here, if we moved ourselves to the left of the picture that you're seeing there would have been the entrance driveway to our house, which basically cut the one paddock in two. So other than the driveway and a fence which cut that paddock in two, it's the same soil, same pasture composition. But what I wanted to do here, and this is both photographs are taken at the same time, I wanted to demonstrate the principles of grazing here. So although I've turned that paddock into an orchard and there's blackberries, commercial blackberries, mandarins in it, I was demonstrating that with a ride-on mower, I was cutting it down to the level of where that stubby might have been, horizontally on the ground, compared to the one on the left-hand side where the sheep was grazing. And basically it's chalk and cheese. When you look at the difference there, one has been overgrazed, it hasn't bounced back. The other one grazed to a certain level, or in this case, grazed by a ride-on mower. You'd think you're looking at different properties at different times of the year because there's green and there's grass growing there. And that's a pretty stark reality. And the number of times we've done that at field days on properties where you go into a paddock and you have a look at the soil and the pasture growing, you dig a hole in the ground to have a look at what the soil looks like. And then you hop over the fence, which might be close by, into what might be a tree plantation, a bush corridor. And as most farms, when you have those corridors, you've never got time to do the weeding or cut the grass. So it's quite often, well over the height of your knee with everything from thistles and grasses. But digging into that, all of a sudden demonstrates the incredible properties of the soil, where it's granular, it's absorbing moisture, and a great habitat for microorganisms, compared to when we go back out into the paddock again, where it's quite compact and hard. And that's always been a wake-up call to the farmers when we do that on a property, because it illustrates to them, their first question, when they're honest enough to say, well, I'm either overstocked or I've left my animals on that pasture for too long a period. Again, theoretical sort of stuff, because you've got to think ways around that. How do we manage that? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Thanks, Kathy. We'll go to the next one.
Chris, can I just ask, do you think that whole moving animals to try and maintain more leaf area is one of the things that horse owners could do better starting today?
Yeah, yep. Certainly. Now we've had a bit of moisture. We've got a growth period. We're coming back to a bit of soil dynamics here, but when I didn't take a soil temperature today, but soil temperature a couple of days ago, when we had a couple of bits of sunshine, was up around 17 or more degrees. And that was down in Gippsland near Wilson's Promontory. I had a field day down there. 17 degrees. Now, soil, when it's a temperature anything above about 10 degrees, you're still got quite good biological activity. The peak during the growing season is around about 27 degrees. So at around about 17 degrees, if you think of a parabola curve, we're halfway up the curve in a sense of the growth opportunities. So we've still got, now we've had a fair bit of moisture, soil temperature's still not bad, so we still should be getting reasonable growth for at least another fortnight. Once soil temperature drops below, let's say 10 degrees, things are really going to slow up. And I always find that an interesting phenomenon that, grass doesn't grow in the spring because it happens to be September the 20th. It happens because of soil temperature and the activity of microorganisms. And microorganisms, for every 10 degrees change in temperature, they double their population. So the dynamics there is all about the soil temperature. And at field days, I always ask people, what are the three things that, if they're the things that are recycling nutrients and getting grass to grow, what are the three things they need? Well, I'm sure that there's those that are listening to this would be saying, well, they probably obviously need moisture, and you tick that little box. And then you say, well, what about, you've mentioned temperature, so temperature is the other one. But the other really important one, which is about our soils, is they need oxygen. So, they're the components which are just absolutely essential for that sort of.
Is it worth measuring temperature on your own property?
Oh, look, it's a bit of fun. These sort of activities can, when you've got kids and grandkids coming along, go and measure the soil temperature. Tell what's the soil temperature today, and they'll come. And it does vary, but there's reasonable. I mean, it's a storage capacity. It's a reasonably ambient sort of temperature in the soil. It doesn't drop by 10 degrees or 20 degrees or something like that. A number of years ago, I'm going back to probably 2014, we had a 3-year case study on an organic farm at Cockatoo, by the way, and we were measuring soil temperature and soil nitrogen over the period, and we're taking it on monthly basis, the actual temperature and the measurements of soil nitrogen, because soil nitrogen is produced by organisms, the biology in the soil. And we're getting really good levels as the temperature rose. There was more and more activity, and there was more nitrogen being released. And we got to Christmas, and things were going really well. And then just after Christmas, when we had the soil analysed, all of a sudden the nitrogen levels dropped down to almost, well, I won't say nothing, but only a few parts per million. We didn't know quite what was going on. And then the property manager came back and said, "Oh, Chris, apologies. I forgot to tell you, but our irrigation broke down." So we had everything going for the microorganisms in the soil to release nitrogen and get the crops to grow. We had oxygen and we had temperature, but we didn't have moisture. And and that's the secret. When we talk about horse properties, they're the things that have to operate on horse properties just as they would for someone that's having beef cattle on their property. You need those ingredients. And as managers of those properties, I guess the question is, what role do we play there? How can we influence the activity of microorganisms in the soil? And I guess the first thing to say is, well, firstly, we need to assess the soil. So the slide you're looking at the moment was a horticultural soil that's been basically smashed. It's a bit like that compacted soil that had the pea rotation in. Continuous cultivation has destroyed the organic matter, and therefore it's lost its structure, lost its oxygen, and basically it's been destroyed. It no longer supports life. Now, that doesn't mean to say that if you happen to bought a property and that's what the soil was like, you can't rectify that, because that'd be the same as rectifying our Macclesfield soils, for example, but it does take a bit of work. So our assessment is basically all about understanding what the soil is and how we can go about remediating it. Okay, we might move to the next slide, Kathy. We've talked a lot about healthy soil and how we can test it. I love the approach on a farm without resorting to quite scientific apparatus. I've been to a number of field days, and I was mentioning to my student this morning, we had a case study in a field day down on Bass Coast a number of years ago, and Monash University was involved, and I think they brought out 4 or 5 PhD students, and that was a real practical example of how theoretical and academic learning needs to be mixed with a practical side, because very few of them had been on a farm. They didn't know what equipment was being used and what was going on. They were great in their own discipline, but the overlap there and the gap in knowledge was quite extensive. But the interesting thing there is, by the time they'd unloaded the ute with a whole range of glass bowls and cylinders and technical equipment, and they were assessing the soil and trying to judge, how healthy and stuff like that. And I found it fascinating, but once they'd driven off the property, other than reporting the results back to the landowner, the practicality of that farm owner saying, well, I haven't got any of that equipment, how can I do it? So that's when we developed across the Gippsland catchment what we called a pretty comprehensive soil assessment. And one of those is just looking at soil compaction. So you can see here, I flippantly describe it as my imported soil measuring gauge, if you like, penetrometer, which normally has gauges, but just a thicker gauge, bit of fencing wire, pressing it into the soil. And I usually carry that round to field days everywhere. Now, generally speaking, that the soil has to be reasonably moist for that to penetrate. On the hard soils we've had over our dry period, that wouldn't be much use. But just at the moment, now that there's moisture in the soil, you press that wire into the soil, and as you're pressing it down, you can feel where there's resistance. And the interesting thing about that, I've done this and I've got other people to walk along with a bit of wire alongside someone with a penetrometer. And we did this down in Gippsland the other day, and the penetrometer was reasonably dry soil at round about 8 centimetres, was measuring 200 psi, 200 pounds per square inch. Now at 200, that means about 80% of plant roots won't penetrate the soil because that's compact. And we did the same thing with a bit of wire, and the wire started bending at round about the same depth. So there we're showing just the practical illustration of using just a little bit of practical local knowledge to do that. In the same way, have I got, I'm just having a look here at our next possibility of a slide. We just quickly scan to the next one, Kathy. We might come back to that. I'm not sure if I've got a picture of a hole with water in it.
No, I don't think you do, Chris.
Okay, don't worry. So the other simple, I mean, we've got 23 parameters we actually physically measure. We'll go back to the other slide with a bit of wire when we do it. But two of the most simple things to understand what's going on in your pastures, in your garden, is to use that bit of wire for a start, press into the soil and see where you think resistance is. With your spade, dig a clod out of the soil. Well, it's three things I should say we're doing. And just see where the plant roots, the grass roots are going. If you felt resistance with that bit of wire, let's say at 10 centimetres, and you have a look at that clod you've dug out of the ground, what's happening to plant roots at 10 centimetres? Are they penetrating and going down like that clod we showed that I was holding up previous to this with the long trailing roots with particles on it? Or are they basically terminating with very fine roots at that 10 centimetre level? So that's a good illustration of saying, no, they're not really penetrating further. What does that mean? I guess it means after Christmas, when we have drier periods, roots aren't getting down to depth and are basically extracting moisture, then we're going to have less growth and less pastures and the pasture drying off. The other one,
I guess that bit of wire
Yep.
helps you to think like a plant root, doesn't it?
Something like that, yes. I think there's probably, in some of the field days I've been in, I think there's more brains in the bit of wire than some of the people I've spoken to. But fortunately, I'm in a good audience here. I don't have to worry about that. But yeah, look, that's the learning there. But alongside, we've just dug that soil spit out of the ground with a pasture. But if we dig another little shallow hole, let's say just a couple of centimetres deep, just a square hole, and fill that with water and watch the water infiltration, that again is a huge learning possibility. If I do that in my Macclesfield soil, basically it just looks like a swimming pool. I can go back in the afternoon and it's actually still there. The water hasn't penetrated that really compacted soil. That part of my property, because I also have a volcanic soil, I've done land classing and I've actually fenced that off and are revegetating because it's such a difficult area to try and grow, and I don't want any erosion events happening on it. So that shallow hole is indicating a couple of things. Obviously water penetration, but then you've got to ask the question, well, why is the water penetrating or not penetrating? If it's not penetrating, it's compacted. If it is penetrating, it means that probably we've got a soil that might look like one of those clods that we saw in an earlier slide, which means that's also an indication of biological activity. Okay, because the soils, we've got the soil aggregates and those particles there, moisture's being absorbed, so I've got a good root environment. Obviously, it helps if you dig a spade level spit, as we've done, and see if there's earthworms around there as well, because they do a lot of that ploughing in the soil for us as well. So there's simple tests. We don't need complex scientific equipment to do that. We just need a couple of simple tests like that and to use our own observational powers. And as I said to my student, my PhD student this morning, I said, look, one of the problems in a number of properties in agriculture these days, people sit up in the tractors, air-conditioned cabins, and they drive over the land and they use their equipment and add fertiliser, and they'll get a soil analysis done, and a consultant will come in and do that and tell them how much to add. And if you ask them, what can you tell me about your soil? And they say, well, I'm sitting up here in the cabin. I don't really know much about the soil down there. I get someone else to do that. That's not the educational process that we're trying to inoculate people with. So
yeah, that's a really good point.
we're hoping for people to understand that. And all the old, I mean, I'm a collector of antiquarian books and a lot of really old English farming books going back to the early days of the century. And people there with obviously, even from horse-drawn implements, are much more involved in understanding the soil and hands-on. And we're a little bit removed here. We've used science, but sometimes we've used science in the wrong way.
Yeah.
There's very much a physical aspect to managing our properties. Okay,
Chris,
we might go on
do
to
you mind if we stop and just briefly ask if there's any questions
please do.
from our attendees?
Can I apologise for my looks as though I've got a strange spelling in my compaction.
Yeah, that's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, so if there's anyone who's got any questions, if you'd put it in the chat or make yourself known by you putting your hand up, we can attend to that. There will be a section at the end for question and answers, but sometimes it's good while it's fresh in our mind to get to those. Now, Mel, would you like to ask a question?
I think that's Nikki posing as me.
Yep.
Oh, Nikki.
No, it's me. Sorry, it's the other Mel.
Yes.
I was talking to someone and they said when there's when we don't have much rainfall, the dew is enough to keep our grass growing. Is that the case?
Well, obviously, morning and night is the best time when the stomata, those little windows on the plant leaves, open, so they will take moisture in at that stage. But it's really pretty much a superficial addition of moisture to it. If you're really wanting your plant roots, I mean, that's what they're doing when they're going into the soil. They're seeking nutrients and moisture. So although the foliar feed, if you like, will provide some nutrients, it's not a long-term proposition because, as you know, dew isn't always on the soil surface. So that will help. It'll certainly leave that green tinge as well because it means we've got a bit of nitrogen in that dew as well. But for longer term benefits, we should be thinking beyond that and saying, well, how can I assist nature? Nature's giving me a little bit of help with the dew, but how can I assist that further?
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay.
I've got a question here from David. How moist does the soil need to be before you use the wire test?
You'll know by just pushing the wire into the ground. If you have trouble and it won't go beyond a centimetre, and I'm not reflecting on anybody's strength here, it's a matter of the wire penetrating, you will know if it's moist enough. Now,
I guess it's still telling us.
Now,
I guess it's still telling us information about what the roots are trying to cope with at the time.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, and that's the prolonged dry period we've gone through, really. Yeah. Okay.
David, feel free to add to your question if you'd like to.
So the next slide is just basically the issue we have with soil compaction. And this could also be, some of you may suffer in winter from pug pastures, the hooves of your animals. This is quite prevalent across Gippsland on volcanic ferrocell soils. Where the hoofs dig in. And the issue there is that once that dries, it can, like a compacted soil, affect dramatically your pasture production. So as it said there, it can reduce pasture growth 20 to 80% if a compacted soil like that. The utilisation of pasture is dramatically affected. The actual tillers or the little shoots coming off the grass is reduced by anything up to 50% or more. All sorts of structural problems can happen in the soil as well. So all those sort of factors, nutrient flows, and that's reasonably obvious, the fact that soil biology is affected. Usually soil biology is affected in terms of a suspended animation. It will be there, but it's just not active until we get moisture to reactivate it. And obviously the cycling of nutrients, and that's what we're relying on with all that microbial population and the worms to break down organic matter and basically take the nutrients in plant roots. Organic matter in the soil contains about 95% nitrogen, about 80% phosphorus, and 40-50% sulfur. And all of those nutrient elements are really important in growing pastures. So soil compaction is a huge problem, both the recognition of it and then how do we deal with it? And we have also already referred to how we might like to rotate our pastures, but maybe we can talk a little bit further about that in a minute. We'll go to the next one, Kathy. Thank you. I took a photo of this probably only about a fortnight or more ago. It was still pretty dry. And what I was trying to illustrate here, you can see in a sense the dry patches of pasture in between what is basically plantain and cocksfoot. And what I wanted to illustrate here is the fact that both of those species are deep-rooted plants. Their roots are getting down to a fair level, and they're the first things that have actually bounced back. And both of those species are quite edible by horses as well, let alone the fact livestock like them a lot. Plantain is, excuse me, quite often put in seed mixes these days, along with chicory and other herbaceous plants that send the roots down to depth. So this was just an illustration of dry soil that has basically got some of those herbaceous species in with long tap roots that basically bounce back because they've got access to moisture a little bit quicker than the surface grasses there. Okay, thank you. Just
once again, biodiversity, I guess, is the name of the game, isn't it?
excuse me, very much so. And a number of you will have heard of the fact that a number of grazing properties now are playing around with and trialling what they call multi-species pastures. So rather than just having ryegrass, which is not great for horses anyway, or just one dominant species. I mean, sweet vernal is a very common grass in the Macclesfield area. It's one of the more low nutrient grasses. But the idea is with more species, we, in a sense, as I keep telling people at field days, people have had a lot of success with the multi-species, with chicory and a range of things. A great animal weight gain in terms of beef livestock, and their pastures have really been improved with them. And they're very much thinking about the top group feeding the animals, which is fair enough because they're getting a bit more of a smorgasbord of a feed. But I'm more interested in the capacity of those mixed rooting species, particularly deep rooting ones that are going down and basically creating topsoil, as our native environment has before we started farming it. If we go back to that analogy I used, excuse me, of looking at road cuttings, and we think of where that topsoil came from, we've done everything wrong. We've looked, okay, that's where the fertility has been built up over thousands of years by the native vegetation. Then we go and clear that. And more often than not, we then plant a shallow-rooted grass like ryegrass, which only goes to a depth about 200 millimetres. And we've lost that ability to form deeper soils. So, as you said, Kathy, that's something we need to think about, is how can we get more deep-rooting species into our pastures. And that's not always easy, and particularly in horse properties where you haven't got access to a lot of equipment. As probably a lot of people have, I've broadcast seed just on a paddock myself by just going out and broadcasting it over bare patches, putting spent hay. Yeah,
just feeding the chooks.
Just feeding the chooks, if you like, and then spreading just a little bit of spent hay over the top to protect it a little bit from the elements and maybe to stop some of the bird species coming in and having a feast. And quite often that'll germinate quite well through that. So that's one way of doing it. Obviously, if you're in a bigger property, you may have people that have access to seed rows if we are talking big properties and bigger paddocks. But most of the time, we're dealing with smaller paddocks that quite often just broadcasting the seed may be a way of doing it. Yeah. Look, what we're looking at here is basically, how do we manage when we go through that dry period? Extensive dry periods. Farmers are pretty smart these days, and particularly as I've found across the Gippsland catchments, where they get regular forecasts from the Bureau of Meteorology and other agencies that say, look, we're in for a dry period this summer. You better think about destocking. So, they'll say, oh, okay, I've only got so much hay. So they'll destock their properties. Now, that doesn't always work. For instance, if you've got a breeding herd, people that are breeding for particular lines of animals or good dairy obviously want to hang on to their animals. So the methodologies they use there is, as quite often horse owners do too, is to either feed in what they call sacrifice paddocks, or in laneways or particular feed pads where the animals feed there, and gives the opportunity basically to rest a paddock. Now, obviously with horses, I mean, it's slightly different. You've got 200 Angus beef cows out on a property. You haven't got quite the same emotional attachment as you have to 2 or 3 horses on your property. So what's the option there? I guess hopefully through the equine land care network, you might be able to say, okay, look, I've got some friends that might be able to adjust just a couple of my animals to see me through this period, and I can hopefully rest that paddock and re-establish it. So that's the thought process there, because you're not, I wouldn't have thought, going to get rid of your animals and destock like a beef farmer might do. But adjustment is a potential one there to at least give the opportunity to go and start restoring your paddocks. Thanks, Kathy. We'll go to the next one. Okay, so what we do now, it's interesting. I've talked to a number of people here, and it's very mixed feelings. There's a number of property owners horse owners, that will rake up their manure. It's a bit like beef cattle too. If you've got a lot of manure around, the pasture that grows out of those species get an imbalance in quite often nitrogen amino acids, which is not great for livestock. So I appreciate the fact that with horse owners, okay, they rake it up. But I must admit, I hate the idea when I drive around and I see these bags outside by the letterbox of horse manure for just $2.50. There's better ways of managing that. Now, I know some people do just leave it out in their paddocks. Others will rake it up and put it on a heap, and others I'd love to see going through some sort of composting process, because in a sense, you're not only just getting rid of what might be an issue in terms of your horse manure, but you're exporting your soil fertility at the same time, because you're not recycling nutrients back into that landscape. And that's pretty important. You're paying probably for imported food and pellets and things to come onto the property, whereas perhaps we could at least minimise a little bit by going through some sort of composting process, spent hay, old bales mixed with the horse manure, where we actually come up with a product that it's not always easy to spread this stuff. Maybe you've got a ride-on mower and a little trailer, and one of the kids can sit in the back with a rake and sort of push it out as you drive across a paddock. But that way, at least you're returning some fertility back into that pasture system, because the last thing you want to be doing is seen as someone that's going to cause, let's say, a Macclesfield dust bowl from the 1940s in the United States, because you're exporting fertility. And that's what we're doing, because even though horse manure is one of the lower nutrient manures in terms of animals, it's still gone through the animal. They've eaten the grass from the paddock. It's gone through their system into the manure, and then it's being taken off. So there's no opportunity for that organic matter to be returned back to the soil. So I'd love to see whether there's opportunities there that we can manage that side of the recycling a lot better. And I was saying to Hansi, my deacon student, this morning at workshops, I've got a big talk down in Bairnsdale, Gippsland, in the end of this month. It's on nutrient cycling. And one of the first slides I show at workshops is a picture of my compost bucket, which is under the sink in the kitchen, which then recycles and goes into a worm farm. And to me, that's the metaphor of recycling, what should happen on a property. In other words, it's a mindset change. If you're thinking in your kitchen, okay, those scraps are going to go into a compost heap or into a worm farm, that you may also take that approach out to a broad acre possibility. For instance, like turning, for instance, your horse manure into compost, or if you're on a broad acre dairy and beef property, what can I do with all that slurry from the dairy? How can I use the manure that's coming from animals better onto my paddock? The old bales of hay and lucerne I've got, instead of just dumping them, how can I recycle those? Can I do it through composting? Can I use it for mulching in my tree plantation? So in other words, you're taking a simple little concept of a bin in your kitchen to how you're actually operating out in the paddock. And that's a pretty important mindset change that I think many people need to take on board.
Chris, can I ask the question of how complicated composting has to be?
It can be as simple as that wire enclosure there. And interestingly enough, that's exactly what I looked at when I was down on this beef property in Gippsland. Although his enclosure I have no idea. He didn't explain to me why it was 1.5 meters tall. It was almost too tall to even put stuff in.
Yeah.
But he was mixing, that was old hay. He'd got a whole lot of, a load of wood chips as well. And he was making compost, but he was also turning that into a compost tea. He was then basically, when that, it was quite a long composting process because it was a little bit like litter you'd get in a forest system, putting into like a hessian bag, which went into a very large water tank, mixed, so it was a dilute tea species, and then he was spraying that out on his pastures. So he was taking that process a little bit further. But as you said, that process can be as simple as basically collecting the manure, putting into an enclosure like that. If there's any other waste like old hay bales or feed that could mix in there as well, or people have the separate bins there that you might have in a veggie garden. I mean, the very common concept in terms of the science behind it is to mix browns with greens. The browns meaning carbonaceous material, which might be leaves and old hay and wood chips and things like that, with green stuff which might be, grass clippings, might be lucerne hay, it might be food scraps, and it might be chicken litter from the poultry house. That sort of mixture, that carbon-nitrogen ratio, if you like, is the thing that gets a heap to break down. But we've also got to go back to nature's system. In a forest system, nature doesn't compost. Leaf and litter falls to the surface there, and through just a longer process of soil aeration and moisture and microorganisms and earthworms and centipedes that take these particles into the soil, nature undergoes its own little composting process. So it doesn't need to be a highly scientific. It can still work on your property.
Yeah, okay. So I don't need to get too upset about doing it perfectly at the perfect temperature. Just get some more organic matter on.
Look, there's a lot of, I mean, I do work with a composter, commercial composter up at Monbulk, and he takes soil temperatures, and because he's producing a product in the end, which is pretty sought after in the horticultural area around the ranges, he needs to make a good product. So that is an important part of getting things right. But no, it can be pretty simple.
Okay, great. We might need to keep moving along just so we can get to the end of your slides.
Look, this is not going to be everybody's cup of tea. There's different ways you can break compacted soil and use soil aeration to try and get oxygen and moisture into the soil. Now, this, mind you, is after we've gone into our paddocks and used the simple little techniques I've talked about. Use our bit of wire, take a shovel. I get most upset if I go to a field day and they haven't taken a shovel out and do a paddock for us to look at the soil. The little shallow holes with water in, that's going to tell you basically what's going on. And particularly if you've dug that spit of the soil with your pasture and your grasses there and finding that the roots just aren't penetrating beyond about 8 centimetres, that's telling you that there is an issue. So then it's a matter of basically choosing the most appropriate technique to do it. In sustainable agriculture, one of our main thrusts is we don't want to turn the soil over. If we turn the soil over and expose organic matter and the soil biology as well, then we're starting to destroy soil. So whatever the implement needs to be non-inverting. The picture on the left-hand side is it's either a yeoman's plough or a chisel plough. So that's gone through at a depth, and I'm not quite sure of the depth, but it might be about 15 centimetres. So it's like a tine that goes through the soil. A disc initially puts a slit in the soil. The tine then goes through, and it's got a little, like a duck's foot on the bottom, which helps to leave a little bit of a channel. I initially used this on my Macclesfield property, but I found because of the texture of my soil, what looks on that diagram like just a run through the soil with not much disturbance, it actually turned up the sods quite markedly where the time went through the soil. So I didn't find that was appropriate. So I actually purchased what I call the rotating knives, and I think that's far more suitable for Macclesfield soils. Now, one of the keys to using something like this, if you've got a bigger property and you think there may be a use for it, it has to be at the right time, because if we did it during the dry season, as you can imagine, going over with the tractor and those rotating knives, it's just going to bounce across the surface because they're not going to be penetrate. So there needs to be a certain amount of soil moisture. Now, just at the moment, we've had a fair bit of moisture. And I'm noticing a little bit of a problem at the moment. I've got a fencer that's actually doing the perimeter fencing around my property at the moment, and he's got a small tractor and whatever. And I'm noticing, because of the fact there's more moisture in the soil now, the treads of the tractor are really noticeable. There's, I'm going to be left with a fair bit of compaction as a result of that. Now, I haven't got a choice because I need the fencing done. So what I'm saying to you, there's windows of opportunity when you use these devices that you need just sufficient moisture so that the blades, let's look at the diagram on the right with the rotating knives, so that they penetrate to the right amount of depth, but at the same time not too much moisture where you're going to compact the soil with the tractor tires. And that may only be opportunities a couple of times a year. So you've just got to down everything, down tools, hop on the tractor and do it. Now, other ways of doing it without that, because we haven't all got recourse to equipment like that, is to how can we do this if we haven't got equipment or other things? And I'm going back probably 20 odd years or more when I did a whole farm property up at Mansfield. And we had some slopes there that their fertiliser, because of the slopes and the topography, it had to be aerially applied. But he was wanting to stimulate more soil biology. So we suggested there that with their spray unit and with the plane going across, we basically resorted to fish emulsion and seaweed sprays. Now, there's a lot more commercial products available now than there was 20 odd years ago. But that was a way of saying, okay, we can't get in with a soil aerator because of the topography and it's too steep. We're trying to get the soil biology to do the work for us. So that means basically, how can we stimulate them? So things like fish emulsion, compost teas and things like that may be opportunities for horse owners to actually do that. We might move to the next slide. Kathy,
Yeah,
I think
thank
it
you.
demonstrates that. Yeah, so fish emulsion, the seaweed sprays, people that are interested in biodynamics, that's a strange concoction made from cow manure stuffed and buried in cow's horn, and compost teas. And just at the moment, we've had a number of field days over the last couple of years on what they call biofertilizers. A bit like compost teas, but there's a little bit more to it, where various ingredients, a bit like making a chocolate cake, but not quite as tasty. And that's made up into a brew that's then sprayed out onto the paddocks. So there's an opportunity for horse owners to do something. Okay, I haven't got the equipment. It's worth trialling because the cost of things like the fish emulsion and seaweed sprays, it's not a huge cost for a few litres of that. You're not going to waste a lot of time. You can do it with a backpack spray and you can just do some strips and see if that's going to work for you, whether there's an increase. Maybe earthworms will come to the surface. Maybe you'll see some different clovers coming up out of the ground as a result. But that's perhaps an easier alternative to try and stimulate the biology to help you with soil compaction issues if we can't get equipment onto it. At the same time, recognising that we're still trying to see if we can rotate our animals around to leave a certain amount of grass. Yeah.
So one of the questions that we had was on that topic of rotation.
Yeah.
When do you move the animals? What sort of time frames are we talking about?
Look, that's going to vary from property to property and even on the same property depending on aspects. On one side of the hill with getting early sunshine, grass is going to be much better on the side of the hill which may be more shaded. But it's more about the time period. A lot of people say, oh, you should rotate every 3 weeks. Well, that's a ridiculous comment to make when you're not on that property. You don't know how things are going. You don't know the texture of the soil and the moisture holding capacity.
Yes.
Everything's going to grow differently on different properties. So it's a matter of saying, okay, I need to rotate it round. I remember Chris saying something about I should be, if I can, let the grass grow to at least the half height of a stubby on the ground or higher. At least half height gives you some feed to be able to go on with and graze it down to, let's say, 5 or 6 centimetres. So that's going to be a personal choice if you can do that. But I know the complexities and how hard it is when you've only got a small number of paddocks. But I guess that's the challenge we face.
Yeah, Pip asked a question about that, about the time frame paddocks should be rested and grazed for. And my answer would be similar to yours, Chris, in that it depends, like how long's a bit of string, it depends. And it's not even the height of a stubby so much, like that's an indication, but different plant species, like cocksfoot will grow like 3 times as high as, say, your bent grass will.
Yes. Yes.
And so which one are you grazing to? Well, it sort of depends on which one you're trying to encourage.
Look,
So
that's exactly, yes.
there's no real answer, but any sort of attempt to let leaves grow and get some good grazing, some photosynthesis happening will be better than continually smashing it. So
Yes.
anything you do is going to be better than nothing, Pip, would be my answer on that one.
Yeah,
and also be careful you don't go too far the other way, which is let's rest the heck out of it. And you got a whole lot of dry, dead material shading the grazing points.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Kathy. Yeah, and it changes obviously the composition of the feed too, because the nutritional, well, it's carbonaceous feed, and as much as that's okay, you want a little bit more nutrients on it as well. Yeah.
Yep. If you've only got 2 paddocks, you're not going to be able to do a perfect graze and rest, but you're going to be able to do better than you would if you had 1 paddock.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Now, I think we might have, I'm not sure, that may be the last slide there.
Last slide, I think so.
What else we'd like to address with a little bit more?
Yeah, so we've now got almost half an hour open time to have question and answers.
Yeah,
so if people have got questions they'd like to think about and post in the chat would be a good way. Otherwise, put your hand up and we can deal with it that way. There is one question here from Emma, and she asks about, is it true that capeweed loves disturbed soil?
Absolutely, but I don't think that's any different than any other weed species. I mean, weed species are colonizers. You know, it's nature's way of covering bare soil, and capeweed and ragwort as well are particularly good at that sort of aspect. You know, I have that issue. I did have a fair bit on one of my front paddocks a number of years ago, and I heavily grazed it with my sheep, but I also made sure I slashed it at the right time even with a ride-on mower. I must have looked silly going backwards and forwards with a ride-on mower. But I was just trying to take you know, reduce its ability and its strength to keep growing. And that worked. It took a while, but that worked on a smaller scale. You know, because what you obviously want is to limit that and then outcrowd it with the right pasture species that you're after. So it may, because anybody that's had a lot of capeweed will know you'll probably be left with a lot of bare patches. So then, you know, given the right opportunity, that's the perfect time, if you can, to get some seed and old hay thrown over the top of that to get some germination happening. But obviously that's a seasonal thing as well.
Yeah. I have noticed that capeweed perpetuates capeweed. Where you had a little bit last year, you've got more this year, and then you'll have more next year, because it seems to crowd out any of the good stuff and shade it out. Yes. And then all that's left is the capeweed seeds to regenerate for next year.
Look, you're spot on, and I think I'm back. I'm going to probably face a challenge this year, because if you remember, everybody, the slide we showed of my very well cropped pasture, there were even bare patches coming in that, and that's going to favour obviously now the capeweed, and now is the perfect time. You're seeing it coming up everywhere. So I'm faced with that problem again, and I'm just going to go through the same exercise in terms of slashing where I can, grazing, because my sheep will still eat that. But it's an issue once you get bare soil, whether it's capeweed or ragwort or other species that you don't want there. I mean, that's one of the really interesting aspects of plant succession, where they dominate to try and restore a bit of fertility back into the soil for the species we actually want.
I have noticed too that capeweed tends to self-perpetuate a very fluffy soil. It seems to keep it very loose.
Look, I think it does. I've certainly noticed. I mean, I do the same when I walk through my paddocks and with a chopper hoe to take thistles and things out like that. And there's always more worm activity around the capeweed and the thistles, for example, than normal pasture. And I'm not quite sure whether it's plant exodites and the root systems there, but once I've chopped them out, the activity there and the grass seems to grow a lot stronger. So I'm thinking there's also an increased release of available nitrogen back into the soil.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, interesting.
I've got another question here from Tweedy and Associates. What level of compost could be considered suitable to add to pastures? Or, probably is a better way to ask the question, what would be considered too much compost to add?
Well, I think too much would be when you completely bury the pasture. You don't see any of your grasses. I mean, there's some species will grow through that. But commonly in beef cattle properties and things like that, it'll be anywhere between 10 to 20 tonnes per hectare. So if you scale that down, yeah. Continue.
Sorry, someone must have an unmuted mic there.
Oh, okay. So that's a matter of whether the compost's available. And if you're making it yourself, that's fine to do that. I can't imagine there's going to be in the quantities that truckloads of it added to properties around across Gippsland.
Yeah.
But always aware for anybody that is going to purchase products like that, please be aware that there are problems in compost. We have had recently in some compost, and I can't name the compost, but there's been some herbicides that have gone through the composting process and caused a fair bit of death in some of the plants that have used that compost. So make sure you know that it's come from a good source and it's well utilised.
Yeah.
There's good recommendations for it. In the same way that any sort of waste you bring onto your property, just like you buy a hay from someone, quite often you'll find different botanical species comes in with the hay. But compost and other additives you might apply to your soil, thinking you're doing the right thing, may also introduce contaminants, which you obviously have to be careful about.
Sure.
Yeah.
I've got a really good question here that I like. It comes from Kylie. For paddocks with a high number of gum trees, and I've got this situation, should we be actively raking and removing fallen leaves and bark to encourage grass growth and improve pasture coverage?
Look, I would say in that situation, yes. I mean, that's the conflict that we have with having native vegetation. I've got it's not quite big enough to be called a corridor, but it's a plantation that goes across one of my paddocks, and it's probably 15, maybe 20 years old now. But the benefit of that is it's a wind protection as well. So my pasture, as a lot of you I'm sure would know that sort of thing, that 20 metres out from that pasture, the grass and the pastures grow a lot better because it's protected from wind. So there's obviously less evaporation. And it grows really well. But I do, because basically it was fenced off, exactly as you're suggesting, because there's a lot of bark that's shred from those trees as well. So I want to make sure the grass will grow. So I do rake up the sticks and the bigger bits of bark. I don't worry too much about scattered leaves, but if it ends up to be like a nice mulch over your paddock, well, then obviously it's going to depress the growth.
I learnt something really important in regards to my situation, which is similar to this, Kylie, about the gum trees and all the litter. And that is when I got a soil test done, the organic matter level came back as being high. And I thought, oh, this is fantastic. I've got high organic matter in my pastures. But in actual fact, it's not incorporated into the soil. It was just sitting on top of the soil. And in many ways, it would have been creating a deficit of nitrogen because of all that carbon all built up.
That's quite possible. Yeah. I just had a thought processes there that you look that's exactly right in that situation, and one to be aware of. I suppose. And that's part of the composting process. That so-called carbon nitrogen balance you have to have.
Yes.
But I will say that if people are going to do soil analysis, when I do my soil analysis and I take my cores across paddocks, I actually put it through a sieve and I separate out the organic matter because I don't want to bias the results.
Yes.
So, just as a matter of principle there.
That was probably what didn't happen in my case. So,
Yeah. So I suppose that's something if we didn't mention at the start of this session that if people wanted further technical information, and that may be, for instance, well, where do you send your soils for analysis, how much it's going to cost? My emails can be available for people if they want to just contact me and I'll tell them to do that. I mean, the home garden.
great.
So a lot of people just test their home gardens with a simple pH kit, and that's suitable. I'd never tell someone to spend $200 to soil analysis on their own garden. They're probably pretty good managers of that. But if it's out on bigger paddocks, then it's probably worthwhile knowing, what we actually are dealing with our soil.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I've got another question here. I'm not sure whether it's from Mel or from Nikki. What can we do to keep our soils from drying out in summer and exposing the soil? If we grow hay and have horses on, does that stress the paddocks even more?
If we grow, hay is the benefit of growing hay is we're growing a crop which is going to probably send roots down a bit deeper.
Okay.
Because we're letting it go to a higher level than we'd normally graze our pastures. So there's an opportunity to build deeper rooting systems. And obviously in terms of a sustainable approach, you're putting hay in the shed and being able to feed your animals rather than purchasing it. So that's a double whammy in terms of a plus, but also aware of the fact that if we're thinking, oh, gee, look, I've done well this year, I've cut 150 bales of hay, I might sell half of those. You're actually exporting, and particularly potassium, from your soil in those grasses. If it's just feeding your own animals, well, okay, that's going to be recycled back with the manure. And that's the great thing about having livestock on your properties, that they're really good little manure spreaders. As long as it doesn't all happen around the drink troughs or the gates where they'll come and get some extra feed. Yeah.
Very good. Another really good question here is, how can I improve the soil in a paddock that always has a lot of moss? That's from Mel.
Okay. Look, the moss is an indication of a couple of things. One, it might not be, and Mel can fill me in there, it may not be getting a lot of sunlight, but it also means that it may be a soil that's crusting. Moss likes basically a tighter soil, more compact soil. So it may be that there's some crusting going along, and that's just a great environment for mosses and lichens and things like that. And it may be aspects. So, sunlight, airflow, pretty hard to do anything other than maybe even just lightly scarifying a paddock. Even very light scarifiers that are right on mower could drag across the surface just to break up that mox. And even if you're only scratching the surface for a few millimeters, you're going to at least get a little bit of oxygen into that particular profile.
Okay, that's really good advice. Have we got any recommendations for deep-rooted species to break down compaction? Probably just broadcast on patches and then cover with compost and then fence off.
Look, I think that's a great idea. If one can do that, fence off. But the species we've actually mentioned, I mean, the grasses, the fescues, cocksfoot, some of the bromes, all deep rooting, along with the herbaceous species, chicory, plantain. They're species that are going to throw the roots down to a greater depth if they can, because as we mentioned, they've got to be able to penetrate the soil. If it's slightly compact, we may have some issues there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the approach. And there's lots of seed merchants around where you can buy just kilos and bags of the stuff. Unfortunately, Bunnings and places like this don't have mixtures that are going to suit us greatly. But there are seed merchants around Gippsland where you can get hold of a couple of kilos of seed, and we just try it. We broadcast it. If you can fence it off, well, that's a huge benefit. If you can cover the seed, just like you're planting seed in a veggie garden with a bit of compost, well, that's obviously going to be a benefit. Or even spent hay over the top of it. I use spent hay because that's going to come with seed as well. That'll help to add extra seed to that particular mix. Yeah.
I've got a question from David about mulching spring grass, whether that can be used as a soil improver. So I guess he's talking about where you've got lots of excess spring growth,
yes.
And mulching that.
In other words, just slashing it down.
I guess so, yeah. Yeah, mulching.
Look, that's fine. the carbon nitrogen ratio of grass is pretty low. It's about 14, maybe 17 to 1, 17 parts carbon to 1 nitrogen. It decomposes. Anybody knows that cut their lawn in autumn and spring, it only lasts a couple of weeks before it decomposes. So it composts really quickly. So as long as it's not too thick, the last thing people would probably know, if they've collected grass clippings and it forms a thick wad, it gets slimy and there's no oxygen in it, that can be an issue. But if it's splashing lightly left on the ground, I think you'd find it would decompose quite quickly and would probably give quite a quick flush of nitrogen.
Very good. And this one's from Gemma. In order to compete with weeds that tend to stop grass from coming through, do we have to change the soil profile, i.e. with fertiliser? That's a good question.
A very good question, because weeds are an indicator of lower fertility. They're preparing the way for the next level of fertility by putting their roots down and forming more organic matter. So I suppose to try and prepare, any sort of organic type fertiliser, composted foul manure, whatever might be available in the form of a organic compost or something spread over it would be of a great assistance there.
Yeah, great. Now I've come to the end of the questions here, but there is a possibility that I've missed somebody. So if I have, can you just say that you missed it and I'll go looking for it? Otherwise, think up your final questions now that we can ask for Chris. And I guess while we're doing that, if I could just ask Chris, if I was a horse owner, which I am, what's the one thing you can recommend that I could do this week that would make the biggest impact?
Look, that's a tough one, because
I know.
you're properly. I mean, it's always based on observations. If I was coming to your property now and I saw the grass was low and not growing, I'd be saying somehow that paddock needs to rest. Or if there's different weed species there, we did a transect across the paddock and there was a range of different weeds there, I'd be saying, okay, fertility's down a little bit here. What can we do to improve the fertility? Can we use some compost there? Can we try some fish emulsion, seaweed, just to start stimulating a little bit of activity? They're the things I'd sort of be thinking of. We've still got, I think, a couple of weeks of reasonable soil temperatures to try a couple of things. But it'd be worthwhile, people, if they want to give it a go. As I say, the fish emulsions and the seaweed sprays aren't particularly costly when you buy them, because they dilute anything down to 100 to 1 or something like that. Pretty easy to lay out with a backpack sprayer and just to see what might happen. See if you can see earthworms coming to the surface. I'm still getting activity from dung beetles, which are recycling my sheep manure. So things are still happening if we want to trial a few things out there. Yeah. Okay,
cool. There's 2 questions here, and I'll limit it at that, so that we can just do our final wrap up. But there's a question here about, could you tell us how dung beetles affect soil fertility and aeration? We have had a dung beetle field day session, and we've probably got most of that information contained in our online information. But just, is there anything you would add specifically to that, Chris?
I will, and just she showed a picture of my book, which is available if anybody was interested in a book on sustainable agriculture and deep time, which is the geological concept. If I've got time to very quickly say, the idea of that, it's a geological concept in terms of understanding that, and was formulated by geologists, that said, basically, everything we wear in terms of, or most things we wear in terms of clothing, the metals we use all come from geological processes which happened millions of years ago and are not going to be replicated in our lifetime. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I wonder if that concept was applied to agriculture, what it would mean. So then I started thinking, okay, well, there's only meant to be 30 to 40 years left of phosphorus fertilizers in the world. We're short of potassium at the moment, and just at the moment, we're short of all sorts of fertilizers because of world problems. What does it mean for soil fertility? Soils take 1,000 or more years to form. So that was the basis of my book. But if I go back, there's a chapter on nutrient cycling and soil biology, and was a number of charts there showing the benefits of dung beetles, because dung beetles are basically they're the first things that start the recycling on our properties. They're the things that take the dung down into the soil. Around the dung beetle channels, there's more earthworms, there's more available nitrogen and phosphorus. Incredibly important. The only problem you have is when you want to do trials and you buy them in, they don't respect fence lines. So the following day, you'll probably find them in your neighbours who haven't contributed to the cost at all. But they're hugely beneficial, increased pasture growth. I'm a sheep owner, so one of the things that it also does for me is that by removing that dung, it's removing habitat for instance, the blowflies, which might end up in blowfly strike on my sheep.
Okay, cool.
There's added benefits there.
Yeah. And the final question I could probably answer quickly, Anita. Can I spray the capeweed in my hay paddock with a broadleaf poison? Would that harm the quality of the hay when it's cut? So as an agronomist, I would answer that very briefly by saying, if you spray now, the poison itself will be long gone by the time you're ready to cut your hay. So it would be beneficial to spray out capeweed so that your hay's better. The whole issue of adding poisons to your paddock is another one, I guess. But if you wanted to spray out, that would be the best solution to increase your hay crop and reduce capeweed in it.
Yeah, and a great opportunity. It's like using, Roundup to get rid of blackberries and things like that. If you're going to use something like that, which I'm adverse to, I would be saying, well, you do that. At the same time, you've got to introduce a positive management to do that. So if, let's say, you're removing blackberries and there's bare ground, well, you want to very quickly revegetate that.
Yes, with something.
Do it. Or if it's in pastures, for example, see if you can do some broadseed seed mixture adding to it to try and get something happening there.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm just going
to... Well, I think we've actually successfully gone through our questions and got some really good answers there. So I might pass over back to Nikki to do our final thank you, and thank everyone for coming.
Thank you, Chris and Kathy. That was actually very good. I've just got some small announcements. We've still got 2 webinars coming up in the following months as part of this series. So please tell your friends, and we're also going to send out a recording of this to everyone. So feel free to share it. Now, as you've seen, we had a slide with Chris's book up. At the bottom of that is his email if you need to. If you'd like to contact Chris. The book is actually really good. It's got a lot of natural amendments and all that. I actually have a copy as well, and it's quite a good book. And also, Kathy offers her services. She'll come around as a property consultant, and she's got her details there as well on that slide if you want to email her. She also has a really good, I think you have a web, do you still have your web page?
I haven't done anything for a fair while.
Look, you can ask. Kathy is sometimes nice enough. If you go to our Facebook group, sometimes people will ask a question and Kathy will answer it, depending on how busy she is. There's also that. So thank you for that, Kathy.
Oh, good.
And finally, now we have the 2 webinars coming up in the next few months, so keep an eye out for them. We post most of our things on our Facebook group. But we also have 3 field days coming up where we'll go over a lot of this and more with Kathy, and they're going to be over the next few months. So keep an eye out for all that. That's normally on our Facebook page. Now, if anyone has any suggestions or want us to look at a particular subject or topic or field day, please feel free to email us. We're here for you, and we really enjoy your feedback as well. And if you want to become a member, because we rely on membership, it's $15 a year. And I've got the QR code up there if you want to scan it. But these particular 3 webinars are free. So please spread the word. And I hope you enjoyed the webinars. And thank you again, Kathy, Chris, and also the Gary White Foundation for their support. Thank you.
Well, thank you to the team and for Kathy for running the slides through. It's been a pleasure working with you. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Chris.
Yeah.